Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight kicks off our first of several talks for our Honors Colloquium Speaker Series. And I'm very proud to say we will be joined by Dr. John Lennox at Oxford University. He is going to be interviewed by our own Dr. Paul Nesselroade, the director of the Honors Program. I have long admired and appreciated the work of Dr. Lennox. He is an international voice for reasoned faith and thinking faithfully about what it means to exhibit Christian values and virtues and intellect in today's complex world. I hope you will enjoy this conversation, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, President Brown. As he indicated, my name is Paul Nesselroade, and I want to welcome all of you to this evening's event, a conversation with Dr. John Lennox. Before we get started, I want to extend my gratitude to all the people who helped to make this happen. Specifically, Asbury's Strategic Communications Team, Asbury's Honors Program, and the wonderful folks at ACA, the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, who are managing this recording. This evening, I have the incredible privilege to be interviewing Dr. John Lennox, Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, and Emeritus Fellow in Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College. Welcome, Dr. Lennox. So glad, it's such an honor to be here with you and to have some of your time.
Well, I'm very delighted to be with you. And President Brown, let me first of all apologize that I'm not able to be with you in person, but a stroke is a stroke. And it's very gracious of you to send Paul over to interview me, and I'm looking forward to it very much indeed.
Well, thank you for giving us your time. So our topic this evening is the relationship between theism, and sometimes we'll be talking about Christianity in particular, and the human activity we call in contemporary terms science. Now you've written widely and carefully about this topic, and I'll be drawing my questions from one book in particular, a recently written Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix? And I'd like to start with this question, if I could. What is your understanding of this term, science?
That is an extremely important question that's very difficult to answer, because it used to be thought that science was very easy to define. It was a process by which you could establish truth by investigating the natural world. And you'd set up a hypothesis, and then you would test it, and then you would refine it, and you'd modify the hypothesis, and so on. And all of those things are associated with doing science. However, philosophers of science agree these days that there is no one accepted definition of science, and what they prefer to do is be more modest. And of course, it's great to see philosophers being modest, and that is to say that science is associated with these following things. In other words, it's a method of investigation. It involves logic, rationality, setting up hypotheses, testing them, and all those kind of things. And they tend to leave it at that. It's a bit like St. Augustine said, when it comes to time, everybody knows what it is until they're asked to define it.
That's good. And there's not one particular method either. So the different methods for different disciplines and different questions. And so it's sort of misrepresented sometimes as one single definable thing.
Yes, that's right. And what's very important there is that there are two actual sorts of science. Now, when we use the word science, we're talking in the English-speaking world of the natural sciences. There are other parts of the world where science is much broader. It means both the natural sciences and the humanities. But for the purposes of our discussion, we're talking about the natural sciences. And there are two main sorts. There's what we call inductive science, and then there's abductive science. And people tend to be less familiar with the second one of those. Inductive science is the kind of thing we associate with repeated experimentation. If we claim that the planets orbit in ellipses round the sun, we can test that any day. We can repeat the experiment. Or if we argue that water is a combination of hydrogen and oxygen, we can test it again and again and again anywhere on Earth. So repeated experimentation has naturally a lot of authority. But then there are many situations where we cannot repeat. For example, if we want to approach scientifically the origin of the universe, we can't say, well, let's do it in the lab and see how it was done. We can't do that. What about the origin of life? Can we repeat it? No, we can't, certainly not yet. And so we have to approach these in a rather different way. There's a science of dealing with unique, unrepeatable events in the past. And it's really a historical method. In fact, we often speak of the historical approach to science. And in history, and for example, in forensic science, one illustration of this is the typical Agatha Christie murder. You see, when the body is found in the library with a knife through its back, Hercule Poirot cannot say, well, let's just do it again and see what happened. No, what he has to do is to go through a process of establishing an argument to the best evidence, an abductive argument. In other words, he says, well, if suspect A did it, we would expect such and such to follow. It does follow, but then there's an anomaly. Something's there that wouldn't have been there if A had done it. But if B had done it, both of those things would be there. So B is a more probable subject of interest than A. And in that way, you get what we call an inference to the best explanation. Now, that doesn't mean it's a weak inference. It doesn't have the same authority as inductive science. But nevertheless, there are many things in life that we cannot, in that sense, establish inductively. If I'm flying to New York tomorrow, I cannot give you an inductive proof that that plane's going to get me there. But there's enough experience that I'll trust my life to it. And if I might just mention, Paul, because it's important, people often say, well, I won't believe in God unless you prove it to me. We need to talk about the word proof, which science is associated with. Proof comes in two very distinct forms. There's the proof that we associate with mathematics, where you start with a set of axioms, you build up your theory by a set of agreed rules of inference, and you come to your theorems that are regarded as true on the basis of those axioms. Now, in no other field of human intellectual activity do you get that sort of proof. You don't get it in physics, you don't get it in chemistry, you don't get it anywhere else. The best you can get is evidences, pointers, grounds. And so when we're talking about proof, we must leave aside that idea that we're going to get a mathematical proof, but we can ask, what's the evidence on which we base our trust? Because real trust and faith, which comes into all science, of course, not only into religion, is only valid as far as its evidences are valid. So I cannot prove to you mathematically that my wife, to whom I've been married for 54 years next week, loves me. But I'd stake my life on it because I think there's enough evidence for it. So there's a huge mix within science of inductive proof where we can repeat the experiment, that's very strong. Then there's abductive proof where we make inferences, say about the origin of the galaxies and so on. That's less strong but can be reasonably strong. And we've got to differentiate when we look at scientific results into what category they fall. And therefore, we must ask the crucial question, what is the evidence on which you believe that?
And so there exists tension between, at least perceived tension, between this and other forms of knowledge. Are there limits to science? Is this, between the two methods, is this as good as it gets, or is there other ways to think about what we know?
Yes, and it's important to probe into this because there's a widespread notion today, and it's common among some of our leading scientists who, in my view, ought to know better, that science is the only way to truth. People like Richard Dawkins and the late Stephen Hawking held that. And it's very common that if it can't be explained scientifically, then it cannot be sensibly explained at all. And so, in direct answer to your question, are there limits to science? Yes, and it's very easy to see. I always think of Sir Peter Medawar, who was a Nobel Prize winner in this University of Oxford. And he said it's so easy to see that science is limited. It cannot even answer the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of life? And he said it is to literature, philosophy, and I would add theology, that we must turn to investigate these things. And he said, you are doing science a disservice if you think it will ever be in the position of answering everything. Now, Einstein looked at it slightly differently. And he observed, as Richard Feynman, another physics Nobel Prize winner, observed, that science cannot deal with ethics. Science can tell you that if you give your granny strychnine, it'll give her a rough day. But it cannot tell you whether you ought to put it in her tea to get your hands on her property. That's an ethical question. And as Feynman put it, science doesn't come labeled with oughts. And so the whole ethical realm is outside the natural sciences. And there's a simpler answer to your question, actually. If science was the explanation and answer to everything, you would have to close down quite a few departments in Asbury, because history, philosophy, social sciences, and languages, linguistics, and all the rest of it are not the natural sciences. But now here is the rub. All of those disciplines I've just mentioned are rational disciplines. And the problem is that many people, as I say, they ought to know better, the high-powered people, think that science and rationality are coextensive, but they're not. All of those disciplines transcend science, and the interesting thing is they are in general more important because the sciences do not answer the question of meaning, which is the biggest question for most people, particularly college students today. Where do I find meaning? The natural sciences can explore the facts, tell you how things work, but they won't give you meaning. They don't give you a holistic picture. They give you a narrow picture. And that is very important. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was a brilliant philosopher in this country and a very clear thinker, he put it like this. He said, you know, science takes things apart to understand how they work. Religion, and I'd add philosophy and so on, put them together to see what they mean. And so if we're going to get the biggest value out of science, we've got to see that it sits as an important part of our methodologies of inquiry, but it's by far not the whole thing. Now, a final point here is, can science give us all the answers? Not even within science does it do it. I often explain it like this. We all know probably the law of gravitation, Newton's law of gravity. What does it explain? Now, I used to think it explained gravity, but it doesn't. Even Newton realized that. No one knows, even today, what gravity is. What the law of gravity gives you is a very precise mathematical way of calculating the motion of heavy bodies in relation to one another. So accurate that you can use it to put a person on the moon. But it doesn't give you a clue as to what gravity is. And here's the irony. To say that once we've got a scientific explanation, we've got the whole explanation is simply false. Now, this, to my mind, is so important that we look at it in another way. Let's look at the boiling kettle. This is perhaps the simplest example. Why is it boiling? Well, there's an explanation in terms of the physics of heat, the agitation of molecules of water moving more and more rapidly, and that's why the water is boiling under the influence of the gas flame underneath it. But I can equally well say, in certain circumstances, that the kettle is boiling because I want a cup of coffee. Now, that's a very simple illustration, but the point is you have two explanations of the same phenomenon. One of them is in terms of exchange of heat. It's a physics explanation. The other is a personal explanation in terms of human agency and volition and so on. Now, what about those two explanations? Do they compete? No. Do they conflict? No. They complement each other. And outside the physics class, the personal explanation is the most important one. People have been enjoying tea and coffee for centuries before they knew anything about heat. Now, I wish myself, let me express a wish, that scientists could see that the same is true of the universe. You can ask how it works. We know a great deal about that. But to give you an answer to the question why it's there and what it means, we need to expand our horizon beyond the natural sciences, but not beyond rationality. And that's why in my book I contend for a strongly rational approach to the existence of God.
That leads me actually to my next question. Working deductively, I think theists, particularly Christians, would largely agree that the pursuit of science fits well within a theistic worldview. That is, if God, then doing science fits well. But you seem to go further. You seem to suggest that the if no God premise of the naturalists presents a terrible problem for the practice of science. In a way, this is sort of reversing the tables, turning the tables a bit on this, on what is popularly considered the way the argument flows. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yes, I could, happily, because it's actually, these are important questions, Paul, and it's worth teasing them out a bit. Let me step back from your question slightly. When I'm approaching this whole business of God and science, I want to say that there are several main areas. The first to start with is the history of science. The second is the philosophy and the nature of science. And the third is the results of science. Now, many other people will start the other way around and they say, look at the way this little bit works and how it's designed, therefore there is a God. I go the other way round. And starting with the history of science, and that brings me to your first point, that belief in God is consistent with the scientific endeavor. When we look back to the pioneers of modern science in the 16th and 17th century, so you start probably with Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and then a whole array of people, Clerk Maxwell, Faraday, Babbage, and so on. And the brilliant, I mustn't forget him because I'm a mathematician, Euler, who was perhaps the most powerful mathematician who ever existed. Most of these people were theists, and practically all of them Christian. And I suppose C.S. Lewis formulated it best when he wrote, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, this is very important and has been developed by many people, notably recently Peter Harrison in Australia, who point out that there's a very strong link between the rise of modern science and the Christian world view. Now, when I mentioned this to Richard Dawkins in a famous debate, which you can see on my website, if I might mention it, johnlennox.org, he said, but look, there's no big deal because most of the people were in countries with a Christian worldview at that time, so it's not surprising. And I said, well, you've forgotten a large part of the world. You've forgotten China in particular. And the very interesting thing is that one of the most famous experts in the technology of China, who spoke the language and so on, did research, and he's written the definitive books on the history of technology in China. And he was a neo-Marxist, so an atheist. And he tried to discover why the Chinese, although they discovered technology, printing, fireworks, gunpowder, that kind of thing, never had an integrative view of science. And he, against all his philosophical principles and worldview, came to the conclusion that the only difference he could see is that the Chinese lacked the unifying principle of thinking that the universe had a single creator who built it to run on certain regularities that we call laws. So Dawkins was wrong. It is the fact that it works in both directions. So my first major point here is that those early pioneers, they started, their worldview was theistic, it was Christian. That taught them that the world is a rational creation. That meant, implied for them, that science is worth doing and can be done. And so the motivation for doing it was their faith in God. Now, the starting thing was their philosophical starting point. We've all got to start somewhere. But then, as they used this basic belief in God to investigate the universe, they came up more and more with the fact that the universe could be, in many cases, beautifully and amazingly described in terms of the language of mathematics. And that raised a very big question. Is this rational intelligibility of the universe actually evidence of a rational mind behind the universe? Now, this is where I begin to argue that the naturalistic worldview, the atheistic worldview, actually is self-contradictory in the end. Now, C.S. Lewis saw this a long time ago. I often have fun talking to scientists. Well, I always have fun. But I say to them, look, as a scientist, you are a believer. And they say, no, I'm not a believer. I don't believe in God. Well, I said, just wait a minute. I didn't say you're a believer in what? You believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Of course they do. And Einstein actually pointed out, and it's important to remember this, that he couldn't imagine a genuine scientist without, I quote, that faith, not in God, but that the universe is rationally, mathematically intelligible. And I was taught quantum physics by the late Sir John Polkinghorne at Cambridge years ago. And in his book, he constantly emphasizes this, that physics is powerless to explain its belief in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Why? Because you cannot do any physics until you believe that. Now, here's my next question. Why should I believe that the universe is rationally intelligible? Should I believe it simply on the basis, well, it seems to work, kind of pragmatics? But what if I approach people and ask them what they do science with? And I often do that, and they tell me about some expensive machine. I said, no, I don't mean that. Oh, you mean your, and they're about to say mind, they're not sure. And they say your brain because they think the brain and the mind are the same thing. I don't, but that's another topic on which I've actually written. The brain, let's take it up from their perspective. They think we do science with the brain. I say, give me a brief history of the brain. And it usually comes out something like this. The brain is the end product of a set of mindless, impersonal forces working through a very long period of time. And I look at them and smile and say, and you trust it? Now tell me honestly, suppose your computer that you use every day, you knew it was the end product of mindless, unguided processes. Would you trust it? And I want an answer, please. I've always got the answer, no, I wouldn't. I said, you've got a problem. Yeah. Here you've got a philosophy of origin that you believe, and yet it destroys the rationality that you are using at this moment to believe it. And Lewis saw that as, in a sense, intellectual suicide. And Polkinghorne said the same thing. Now, what is most interesting is that this argument, which Lewis saw ages ago, he put it in a lovely way. He said, any argument that purports to undermine rationality cannot be true because you reach it by using your rationality. But in this contemporary world, we have the philosopher Thomas Nagel in New York, and he sees the force of this argument. And he says there is a problem. Now, he's not a theist, he's an atheist. In fact, he's a hard atheist. He actually writes he doesn't want there to be a God, which is very interesting. That's desire rather than giving rational grounds. But he says that there's a real problem here. Because if evolutionary naturalism of the type that I've just described is true, then you've no grounds for believing anything that this apparatus tells you. And there's my big trouble. That's one of the major reasons I'm not an atheist, is that atheism destroys the logic, not only that I need to do science, but the rationality I need to engage in any argument whatsoever. And that brings me back. Here is an inference that strikes me as being very tight. And it leads me to reject the hypothesis that atheism is true. It is self-destructive. And I was delighted to see Nagel's work appear, because he really has put an intellectual bomb in the community of people who believe that the atheists have it, the naturalists have it all their own way. I don't think they do. So that seems to me to be evidence for the truth of the alternative hypothesis, that there is a mind behind the universe. Now, you're right in saying, well, this argument goes in two different ways. If there is a mind behind the universe, what would you expect to find? If suspect A did it, what would you expect to find? Well, in this case, I'd expect to find that there are traces, there are signs of intelligence in the universe. Now, one of the biggest ones for me is the fact we can do mathematics. It's not the results, it's the fact we can do it to get the results. Speaks to me of a mind behind that universe. That's in the intellectual world. That's an abstract discipline. But then in the actual material world, in the biological world, you and I have lived to see that every one of the 10 trillion or so cells in our bodies contain a huge database, a chemical database. And it's given rise, ironically, to the longest word we've ever seen in 4 chemical letters, the human genetic code, 3.4 billion letters long. Now, the irony of that story is that many of the people that I challenge with, please tell me why you trust your brain, are working on genetics. So when we finished our little discussion and they tell me they wouldn't trust the computer and so on, I say, well, now tell me about the human genome. What's its origin? And they say chance and necessity. And I just laugh. And I say, but that just doesn't make sense, because your code word codes meaningfully for proteins. And once you see that kind of thing, a signifier that's linguistic, and you only have to see a few letters of a word like EXIT above a door to know that whatever physical processes have been involved, intelligence has also been involved. And that's why I want to argue God and science mix, that there are signs of intelligence. And it's important to realize that I want to be in a position, let me put it this way, of believing things that have real explanatory power. And the more I've studied atheism, and I've spent a lifetime studying it, not only in the West, in the comfort of the academic world, but in the Eastern former communist world, where I've seen it in action. And both of those lifetimes, so to speak, spent in doing that, have brought me to the conclusion that atheism is intellectually false, but it is also utterly dehumanizing and devaluing. And we can see evidence of that in the world today, tragically.
You've opened up a lot of topics there that I want to sort of dive into more here. Just in passing, though, I want to throw my weight behind Peter Harrison's work. Fantastic stuff. Also, you reminded me of, well, Darwin himself had his doubt, right, about the intelligibility of a monkey's brain, right? How do you say it?
Thanks for reminding me of that. I should have said that when I introduced it. People often say, where do you get this argument from? And I say, well, you'd be surprised to get it from Darwin, because he could see that if his theories were true, then what would a monkey's thought mean? And he had a real doubt, and he expressed it in one of his letters to a friend. So he saw the force of that argument. People see it even more today because the strength of the doubt has been increased by the increase in scientific knowledge. It hasn't been diminished. You see, you'd expect it to diminish if science was going to uncover something, but it's the exact opposite of that has happened. So the doubt is spreading like cancer, but I hope it's spreading like a good meme, so to speak.
Okay. I want to flip the infants around instead of sort of top down. If God, then doing science fits well. I gather that Cosmic Chemistry was written to reflect some recent thinking on your part about the argument from design up to theism. And I know this is a bit more contentious.
Yes.
Let's take each one on its own. First, you suggest that there is a powerful argument from the fine-tuning of physical constants and the initial conditions up to a designer. What is that argument?
Well, I was asked to address a group of very strong, mostly atheist philosophical students here in Oxford by a very well-known professor who's also an atheist. And he said, will you come and talk to them? I said, sure, I'll talk to them. He said, they'll eat you alive, but we'll give you a good dinner afterwards. And he said, I hope you're going to use the best argument against atheism I know. Well, I said, if you tell me it, I'll use it, you see. I said, what is it? He said, fine-tuning. He said, if ever I were to become a believer, it would be because of fine-tuning. Now, the idea of fine-tuning is important because it is accepted by the vast majority of scientists, irrespective of worldview. And that's very important. It's nothing like as controversial as some of the biological discussion about evolution. And that's why I think it's very important to go there first. And the basic idea is, well, you can illustrate it informally, and that gets it across to people probably better. Think of the solar system. If the sun was much further away from the earth, it would be too cold to have life. If it was much nearer, life would be impossible because of the heat. If the earth rotated a little bit faster, we'd lose the atmosphere. If it rotated slower, we'd be boiled to death in the daytime and we'd be frozen at night. And those parameters have to be just right. It's a bit like the Goldilocks story. Just right. Now, when you come to investigate the fundamental laws of physics and some of the so-called fundamental constants, the accuracy to which they have to be just right is mind-boggling in the extreme. For instance, the most impressive one, was worked out by Professor Sir Roger Penrose, who is one of the century's greatest mathematicians and lives just down the road here. Brilliant mathematician. And he's not a theist. He's actually, I think, president of the Humanist Society here. Lovely chap and a brilliant mathematician. And he wrote a book where he talks about, and these are his words, in order to get a universe like this one in which there's a second law of thermodynamics, that is, disorders on the increase. If you buy even the latest Lincoln convertible, it will rust eventually. Disorder increases. If you want to design a universe like that, the creator's aim has to be accurate to one part in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123. And that's a number that's so big that if you write a 1 and then write zeros on every elementary particle in the universe, you can't even write the number out in a decimal expansion. It is mind-boggling. Now, that has led a number of leading scientists, and Paul Davis is one of them, whom I know from Arizona State University, it's always worth reading, to have the impression, he says, of design is palpably there. He's not a theist, but he sees that there's something, there's something going on here. And you see, again, the argument from consistency. If human beings, as I would want to say, are special, these constants have to be, science has shown that, extremely carefully selected in order to have a planet like this on which there's biological life. It's the fine-tuning for life is the crucial thing. So that this is an argument that's to do with physics and chemistry. It has nothing to do with biology, you see. We need a fine-tuned universe in order to have life. Now, that's hugely important because there are many people, including some Christians, who feel that the whole argument about God and science stands or falls on biological evolution. It doesn't. The fundamental thing is the actual conditions that we have to have in existence before you can have any possibility of biological life. The problem of the origin of biological life, which is still not solved, is a massive problem. But no argument from evolution and the ins and outs and possibilities of that can be a defeater for the argument from fine-tuning. And that is why I think it is a very powerful argument. Now, you can say it doesn't prove there exists a God. Well, that's true. It's not proof in the mathematical sense. It's consistent with the idea that there is a God, and it certainly makes a plausible base for an abductive reason that there is a God.
Absolutely. Well, you do go further, and you do bring in other arguments, including a biological argument in this book. You argue that there is a biological version of fine-tuning, perhaps not as powerful as the physical constants, but it's gaining in sophistication and power. Could you talk us through what the trajectory of what's going on now?
Well, in as much as I understand it, I got to make very clear to the audience that I am not a professional biologist, but I've studied a lot of biology, and I've actually gone to seminars in Oxford over a period of time to try to discover what's going on here, because it's extremely exciting work. Because, you know, it used to be when I was a student at Cambridge, it was all cut and dried. The neo-Darwinian synthesis, the so-called modern synthesis, had it all. It was simply a matter of natural selection operating over a very long period of time, and the variations were caused by random mutations and so on. But that is now coming under heavy question, not from a bunch of theists or Christians, but from the scientists themselves. And this is a new direction in biology. It's called the third way. And it has got to the extent where a couple of years ago there was a major meeting in the Royal Society where there were a whole array of people standing up to question the neo-Darwinian synthesis. Now, most of them are atheists. Most of them are looking for a naturalistic solution. But what they're realizing is that the neo-Darwinian synthesis is so simplistic and not fit for purpose that, in the words of my colleague Dennis Noble, fellow of the Royal Society here, one of the most brilliant physiologists on the planet, who made the first mathematical model of the beating heart, and who's a pioneer in this third wave of biology, said this synthesis needs to be replaced. Now, what they're attempting to do, very understandably, is replace it by a purely naturalistic. But I think there are problems here, because just as the mathematical describability of the universe and the genome itself indicates that there's some kind of intelligent planning going on here, because these are words. What is being revealed by biological work, particularly in epigenetics, is that the level of language-like complexity in the genome is only the first level. There's level upon level upon level. And what they're coming up with is this incredible notion that it's not just a simple coming together of atoms and molecules and building up to the top, that it's a chicken and egg situation now. You need the cell to produce the proteins. You need the proteins to produce the cell. So it's very much chicken and egg. And it moves slowly but surely, it seems to me, to scientists slowly and gently and very tentatively bringing in some kind of teleological dimension. So they talk about the cells having some kind of cognition within themselves and a sense of purpose and all this kind of thing. Now, they're very careful in defining their terms. And all I want to say is that this notion that evolution solves everything and proves there's no God is nonsense. And the first thing to say about that is natural selection and mutation clearly do something. I mean, look at us two. We look different. Why is that? Because there was selecting. Our parents did a bit of selecting of each other and so on and so forth. And life is very sophisticated. It's capable of niche adaptation and so on. And if that's what you mean by evolution, that's no problem. We see it all the time. It's often called microevolution. There's no controversy about that. But it's when that mechanism, which clearly helps actually living species adapt to a niche, is now brought to bear to explain everything, then the problems really start. And they start very far back. Richard Dawkins wrote a very influential book called The Blind Watchmaker. And in it he claims, I won't have the text exactly right, but something like this, that the blind automatic mechanism that Darwin discovered, natural selection, is the explanation for the existence and variation of all of life. It took him many years to admit that that sentence was at least half wrong. Natural selection cannot explain the existence of life because natural selection depends on life pre-existing for it to do anything at all. It does something, but whether it does all that people claim is, it seems to me, very much coming under question. Now, I'm not saying the whole edifice is going to break. It's a very powerful edifice, but it leaves me as a mathematician, and you've got to know this, that mathematicians have had for years a track record of skepticism of the capacity of natural selection to do very much. So that, in a sense, what many of us felt years ago, and I was introduced to these ideas as a 17-year-old by a writer called R.E.D. Clark, who was a skeptical chemist about this. And all through those years, my interest has increased and my skepticism has increased. Now, I know many people who'd say, well, evolution is the way God did it. I want to then question them carefully, what do they mean by evolution? When God gets involved, because it seems to me that the dividing line is whether you can understand the world by purely materialistic processes or whether there's a mind getting involved. That makes a huge difference. And some of the most strong theistic evolutionists I know will still often, when it comes to human beings, say God then implanted a soul. And so they have a discrete intervention of God where he feeds something in. Now, many scientists, they hate that. This idea of an intervening God, a God who tinkers. But I don't think that's the biblical picture. I mean, it's very interesting that the Genesis account, and I've written a book about that, and I'm not going to go into it in detail here. It says, and God said, and God said, and God said, a very few times. So that you've got a sequence of speech acts where information is fed into a system. And that seems to me to correspond with the evidence we have. There seem to be leaps of some kind. And what the Bible is claiming is they came about by inputs of information. And it's a genuine scientific question, a very interesting one. Can we tie that down? Can we argue scientifically that there actually are discrete jumps in informational level? Because that renders more plausible the fact that it's very interesting, just while we're on that point, to compare that we've two philosophies really clashing here. Because the naturalistic one is everything proceeded bottom up. You know, we start with nothing, the current physical thoughts, nothing becomes something, and then something becomes everything. I'm putting it crudely, but that's what they believe. And it's all through unguided natural processes. That's the bottom up. That's being questioned within science, particularly by what I was saying about the cell and so on. But the other way round is that mind is primary and matter and energy are secondary. The current atheistic, naturalistic worldview is that nothing, matter, energy are primary. Everything else is derivative. The biblical worldview, which clashes head on with that, is in the beginning was the Word. God is primary, an intelligent God, and everything else is secondary. So there's where the battle lines are drawn. And my conviction increasingly at the ripe old age of nearly 80 is that the science is beginning to come round to the biblical view, where science itself started in the modern sense.
And that was going to be my last, in this series, was this last argument about, you have a chapter in the back of your book, The Origin of Information, a word-based Sprachwork, speech work world. And you've already talked a little bit about that, but maybe do you want to develop that any more?
Well, it's an idea that I think is well worth exploring, the idea of speech work. Because although it's foreign to our imagination, we live in a world filled with evidence of it, where the speech work, we pick up a book, it's got physical characteristics and so on. But we know, even if we see only a couple of words in it, that there's a mind behind it. And I think what I would emphasize here is we need to do a lot more thinking on how we recognize signs of intelligence. How do we perceive it? Because it's a perception that there's meaning. It's not, in that sense, a mathematical proof. It's a perception. You see. And I do believe, actually, there needs to be more philosophical work on the nature of perception. Because in the New Testament, from the Christian perspective, Paul says that we look out at the universe and we see that the power of God is perceived, not proved, perceived in the things that are made. And that intuition, that perception, I think is enormously important.
There's so much to think about there. I want to keep an eye on the time. So let me push us in a little different direction here. And I'm trying to think how to push back a little bit. I would say that some of my colleagues, other Christians who are scientists and thinkers might say, is it really wise for Christian scientists to promulgate arguments deriving theism from apparent design? Might that, in the end, as more is learned, turn out to be a god of the gaps that might prove to be an embarrassment, bad science and bad theology sort of combined?
Well, it certainly could be and has been. I'm really allergic to the God of the Gaps accusation. But in my book, I develop an idea that partly goes back to John Polkinghorne, in that there are good gaps and bad gaps. You see, what I call the bad gaps are the gaps that are closed by science. And science has got rid of a lot of religious nonsense in the past, like the gods of thunder and lightning and all that kind of thing. You only need a course in elementary atmospheric physics to deal with them, and that gap is closed. But then there are what I call the good gaps that are opened by science. And one of the most obvious ones of those is work on the origin of life. When Miller-Urey did their experiment many years ago now, they thought they'd nailed it. They discovered some of the amino acids by passing an electrical discharge through a test tube. And they got some amino acids. But they didn't know, it wasn't known for years after that the problem wasn't so much the amino acids, although that still is a real problem. The problem was getting them in the right order determined by the genetic code and sequence, which is then a linguistic problem. So the problem over the years has got more difficult, provided you only will address it with naturalistic presuppositions. Now, here's an interesting thing, and it goes back to your very first question: what is science? Some people define science as applied naturalism. Now, if you define it that way, well, that's fine. But I say, look, you are closing yourself off from areas of knowledge which you, by definition, cannot reach. For example, if I design in physics a machine that can only detect visible light, and you come along and your name happens to be Röntgen from Würzburg in Germany, and you say, I have detected some radiation which I call X-rays, and I say, well, let me have a look with my machine. No, they don't exist. And you would laugh at me. If you have a machine that is designed not to detect them, then of course it won't detect them. But that doesn't prove they don't exist. And therefore, I want to plead for expanding rationally our expectations that, and this comes from my mathematics. You see, if you try and solve an unsolved mathematical problem for a few centuries, and you fail to do it, then what mathematicians often do is they don't give up, they try and prove it's false. Now that is an important thing, you see, because some people in physics, and I've written about that as well, have likened the attempt to get the origin of life by purely natural processes as creating a perpetual motion machine. And we know from physics that that's impossible because there's a law of conservation of energy. So here's the interesting question: is there a law of conservation of information? Some people argue that there is, but that's quite difficult because defining information is very difficult indeed. And what that brings me back to is I am allergic to the accusation that I believe in a God of the gaps. But, you see, come back to my story about well, I didn't tell it in this way, so let me tell it in this way. I often do an experiment with people at the dinner table who tell me that they are reductionists. They believe that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. So let's bring that word in for the first time, because this goes along with naturalism is reductionist. And everything, and there was one famous incident where I was sitting beside a very eminent biochemist who was very annoyed that he'd been put beside me when he discovered I believed in God. And he said, we've nothing to talk about. I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, there's nothing, we're going to have a miserable evening. And he believed it. I said, no, we're not. I'm very interested in reductionism. I know of at least 3 kinds. What kind are you? Well, he wasn't quite sure how to answer that. So I said, well, there's methodological reductionism. We split a big problem into smaller problems and we try and solve the smaller ones, get insight in the big one. Oh, he said, I do that. Well, I said that we're united in that. But I said, I think you are what we call an ontological reductionist. That is, you reduce everything in its being, in its ontology, to physics and chemistry. And he said, that's right. Okay, I said, let's do an experiment. And he said, what, at the dinner table? I said, yes, this is Oxford. So I picked up the menu and he looked at it. I said, have a look at this, roast chicken. He said, what's the big deal? I said, nothing. I said, how do you know it's roast chicken? Well, he says, it says that, R-O-A-S-T, roast. How do you know that? Well, he said, I've independently learned the English language and I recognize it. Okay, I said, that's great. That has meaning for you. Yes, he said, it has. Okay, you're a reductionist. Yes. Everything in terms of physics and chemistry. Yes. Well, I said, explain the way in which those symbols carry the meaning roast chicken in terms of physics and chemistry then. Dead silence. It was really funny. His wife said, get out of that if you can. And then he said something that was astonishing. He said, John, I have gone into my lab for the last 40 years believing that could be done. He said, it can't, can it? Oh, I said, you're going to postulate an intelligence of the gaps, are you, to explain it? Ah, but it's not an intelligence of the gaps. It's an intelligence that is demanded by the utter impossibility of a naturalistic explanation. And that's why I don't believe in the God of the gaps.
Wow. I don't know how to respond to that.
That's all right.
That's powerful. That's powerful. It's powerful. Wow. Okay, let me move us into a little bit of the moral sphere here. That is, doesn't a world brought about by random forces with the intent of the creator perhaps there, but hidden in the shadows, doesn't that protect the Christian God from a direct assault from the problem of bad design, the problem of evil?
I don't really think so. I think the problem of evil and suffering is the hardest problem anybody faces. And this is worthy of a whole discussion in its own right. I was motivated to write a book actually on the coronavirus because of this, but very briefly, and we must run, I think, very soon to a conclusion, but this is really the hard question, but it's hard for anybody. And I'll just say a couple of things about it, if I may, as we draw to an end. And the first one is this. Atheism and naturalism, as you say, seems to protect everything, whether there's a God or not. That's just how it is. Get used to it. That's how it is. And so they think they've solved the problem. Well, in a sense they have, but they haven't got rid of the pain or the suffering. What they have got rid of is all hope. Now, as a Christian, I have hope. That may not be justified if Christianity is false, but atheists need to see that the conclusion of their argument is to remove all hope death's the end, the heat death of the universe, or physical death before it, and so on. That's point number one. Point number two is, I have a problem with them in describing it as a problem of evil. Where does the concept of evil come from? Especially if Richard Dawkins is whispering in my ear, saying this universe is just as you would expect it to be. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice. His philosophy doesn't allow him to believe in evil. So there's the end of the problem of evil. And that is a very important area of philosophy, that we find that values do exist. We're moral beings. And there's a very good argument. Even atheist J.L. Mackie, who worked here in the philosophy department, said if absolute morals exist, then there's a very quick argument to a God there. And they do exist. I've never met any sane person that believes that torturing infants is correct. So there's a big problem. Now, I come now to the Christian side because I have a problem. I believe that there is a good and loving God. So I'm faced with that problem. And I'm very well aware, with much discussion and reading, that when we say, what should a God who's just and good have done, and all the rest of it, we never get anywhere. And again, my mathematics teaches me, if you never get anywhere asking a question, you're asking the wrong question. And I think this is a good place actually to rest this, because the question I've come up with that helps me most here, Paul, is this. Granted that the world presents everyone, whether an atheist or a Christian believer, with a mixed picture. I call it barbed wire and bombs, or beauty and bombs. That's the picture. It's mixed. Then any philosophy or religion worthy of the name must have an answer to it. So, from my perspective now, speaking as a Christian, how do I cope with that? I ask myself this question. Granted that it's like that, and I grant it's like that, this universe is a damaged universe, and we could go into that, and all this kind of thing. Whether it's bad design or it's broken is a big question. So we'll not go into that. We'll simply say, granted that it's like that, is there anywhere any evidence that there is a God who we could trust with it? Now that's equally hard, but it's a question that takes us further. And that brings me to the fact that I find the scientific evidences and thinking about God and science very profitable. But in the end, since Christianity for me is not just a philosophy, it involves a personal relationship with God, I've got to come to that personal dimension and historical dimension. Because Christianity is not just a philosophy. Anybody can think up a philosophy. It's geared into history. It makes certain claims. And one of those claims is that God has become human. It's a colossal claim. God has become human, and therefore Christ on the cross, which is at the heart of Christianity, that's God there. And it makes me ask, why? What's God doing there? Well, clearly, at the very least, it shows me that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. And that's where I then begin to say, now, if that was the end of the story, we'd never have heard of it. But it's not. The claim is that Jesus broke the death barrier and rose from the dead. And then the scientists come piling in and saying, but that's a miracle. Miracles break the laws of nature. End of story. I'm not prepared to accept any of this. And that is one of the most important questions that scientists ask. So should we finish with that one?
Yeah, unless you have any particular advice for undergraduate students growing up or attending school in an increasingly post-Christian world. That's a sort of a different question, but if you had a few thoughts about that, that might be...
It's actually related to it, Because one of the embarrassing things about Christianity for many college students is its supernatural dimension. That is where C.S. Lewis helped me a great deal. Read his book on miracles. And I think it's worthwhile college students, and I'm glad you asked it in that way, face this, because there is a pretty simple answer to this question. David Hume, the Enlightenment philosopher, Scotsman, he said miracles break the laws of nature. They violate the laws of nature. And so we can't believe in them. But just a minute. When I'm in the United States, I often see these notices, violators will be towed. And that's the laws of the state if you park in the wrong place and so on. And the big confusion in many people's minds is that the laws of nature are like the laws of a state. Now, Lewis gave an illustration to explain why miracles do not break, that is, of the type of the resurrection. I don't believe any miracle story. I'm very careful. But things like the resurrection do not break the laws of nature. And you say, how can you say that? Well, suppose I came to the University of Kentucky and I stayed in accommodation there in a hotel. And on my first night, I put $100 in the drawer. Second night, I put another $100 in the drawer by my bed. And the third morning, I come to clear out my drawer and I find $50 in it. What do I conclude? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of Kentucky have been broken? Now, it's obvious. I conclude that the laws of Kentucky have been broken. But how do I know that? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. 100 plus 100 remains 200. That tells me that a thief has put their hand into the system and stolen $150. Now, that's a very simple illustration, but it's brilliant, because the problem with materialism and naturalism is that it delivers us to a closed universe of cause and effect. But this universe is not a closed universe of cause and effect. It's an open universe created by a God who has built into it certain regularities that we describe in mathematics and codify as the laws. But they are only our descriptions of what normally happens. The law of gravity says if I drop an apple, it will drop towards the center of the earth. That doesn't stop you reaching out your hand catching it. So to say that God cannot, by his power, raise Jesus from the dead, you see, we're not claiming that natural processes did it. The Christian claim is God raised Christ from the dead. So he's feeding a new event into an open system. Science cannot say anything about that whatsoever. Now, when I read that as a boy, as a teenager, that immediately showed me that this idea that science cannot coexist with the resurrection of Jesus was sheer nonsense. And the interesting thing is this, and it struck me as a wonderful irony. You cannot recognize a miracle of that sort if you don't know the laws of nature. If you thought the dead bodies all popped up and down all the time, you'd never recognize the resurrection as anything special. So I would encourage college students to really get clear that Christianity has a strong supernatural dimension, and you can stand on that as rationally credible. But you said, what advice would I give to them? Well, I have lots of advice. I'm an old man now. But one of the things I would say is when I was your age, you students, I used to think, I'll solve all the problems of life and existence when I'm 25, and then I'll begin to live. And a friend of mine started to laugh when he heard that. I said, you got it all wrong. I said, what have I got wrong? He said, solving the problems of life is living. And that has had such an effect on me in my life, to realize not to look at life as a series of problems to be solved, but as a series of opportunities to grow in maturity. And from my Christian perspective, a series of opportunities to learn with the Lord's help. And I would encourage people to do what I did. my eyes were opened to the value of Scripture, so that I learned in my first year at Cambridge to take it as seriously as I did my mathematics. And getting that perspective that Scripture is good philosophy, it's good history, it's hugely good advice, but it gives an analysis of all the big issues in life that is credible. Get to know that. And I've tried to write on that for students. And one book of mine, if you care to look at, is my book on Daniel, which is called Against the Flow. We've a huge current of secularism in the world today, and students have to swim against it. And I wrote this book because what Daniel faced in ancient Babylon is almost exactly the same as students face in universities around the world today. So thank you very much.
Thank you
for this interesting conversation.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. And thank all of you who've been listening along. I hope it's been enjoyable and enlightening. And have a good evening. Thank you.